Begin the current Daf Mesechta Bava Metzia Daf Pei Test. Begin 6 lines down at the top of the Yamid, where the Gemara is in the middle of explaining the sources and the limitations of the halach of our previous Mishnah. We're talking about when you hire a worker, which is the theme of this paragraph, as a Pailim. Previous Mishnah said, although the prior Mishnah we had spoken about those who eat because of minhag or because of pasak, as you made up, there are certain people that are workers that could eat minhag Torah. And there are two different categories. One is when it's mechubel karka. That's actually the pasuk that is brought regarding a worker explicitly, regarding when it says in the Torah, kisavel kamriacha, which the Gemara explains is talking about a worker. That's b'shar skemar malacha. And then there's talish min karka, which actually is learned out from the halacha of a behema, which the Gemara ultimately compares the behema to a worker, where it says that the ox has to be able to eat when he's doing the threshing. That's by something that's detached from the ground, because that's what threshing is, already detached. And that's actually nigmar malachtai. That's if it's not yet finished the process for the halacha of meiser or chala, as actually our Gemara is going to continue right now, qualifying that pasuk of lisachsim shebedishay, which again applies to both the shiur and the pile, to explain when do we say that they have to be allowed to eat and when not. Shiur corresponds to Kazakh and Chazka, turn to the Becham, turn to today's Daf, Shbizchus, Vachim Yisrael, Yisrael, throughout the entire world, Shbizchus Shimon, Shbizaycha to the Or of the Torah. So discussed in today's Daf are Dayish. The pasuk says B'dishay, which is Toma Dayish regarding threshing, which is when you have the grain and in the chaff and in the stalk, and then you step on it, you thrash it, that it should come out. So that's when the Torah tells you that don't muzzle the ox when he's doing this. So we learn out that it has to be similar to disha, which is davish geduli karka, something that grows from the ground, which is what a stalk is. Davish b'shaz gemar malacha has to be something that's towards the end of the process, which is what threshing is. It's towards the end. But it's davish le'nigma malachta l'maisel chal. It has to be something that, just like threshing, it's not yet like smoothed into a pile after you thresh it and you have the kernels and you make a pile of it. That's when it's mechuyev meiser, all that's in challah, which is later when you put the flour together with the water. Then you wouldn't have the heter either. It has to be in this like zone of the disha area, which is towards the end, but it's not yet kamar malacha l'meiser l'challah. The Gemara discusses the question of anav medava acher. The halach is that you're not allowed to eat the grapes with something else. It has to be only the grapes itself. The Torah only lets you eat the thing, not to try to get an appetite with something else. However, the Gemara wants to know regarding other things if it is compared to anav medava acher or not. Another area that comes up is also kavala meiser, that certain things might actually establish its obligation for meiser. So, like when you dip the grapes into salt, that's a question. Is that maybe of a question of anav medava acher, which would be a monetary question, or is a kavala meiser would actually make it now mechuyev meiser, and that would maybe be its own inherent problem that you wouldn't be able to eat it simply because you didn't separate meiser yet. So begin the current Daf Pei Taz, 6 lines down at the top of the Amid. The Gemara discussed, just really on top of these words that we said from the previous Daf, there's two psukim. There's kisave b'kerem re'echa, v'chalta novim. You're going to come into your friend's vineyard and you're going to eat the grapes, kenavshecha, like your desire, sabecha, that you're satiated, and b'keli chalisitin, you shouldn't be putting into your own bowls. You're putting into the employer's bowls. And it says kisave b'kamas re'echa, b'ketafta b'lilis b'yadecha, b'chemesh le'san v'alkar kamas re'echa. We explain many of these words of these psukim, but it's basically granting the worker permission to eat from the owner's crop that he's working with. Then there was another pasuk, l'sachsim shar b'dishay, not to muzzle an animal working with food, specifically while threshing. And we made a hekesh of, we didn't have to say the word shiur. The reason why it's saying shiur is to compare the chaysim l'nechsim v'nechsim l'chaysim, that comparing the halachas of the mezler, really meaning referring to people, with the halachas of the muzzle, which is the animals. Basically both psukim apply to both, so we know that this halacha of mechuber and talish applies to the ox and to the worker. Now, however, there are limitations as to what and when the worker may eat, and that's what the Gemara discussed right now. Tan Rabban, in the Brisa. Dayish, it says in the pasuk, "Loisachsim shar b'dishay," don't muzzle an ox when he's doing the threshing. So, when does it tell you that the animal, the worker, whoever it is, because everyone has the same halacha, that you have to let him eat? Is ma dayish miyuchad, just like threshing is distinct as davish geduli karka. It's something that grows from the ground. There's a parenthesis over here, which really, it says another thing, but it's not really what this price is I'm coming to teach, but it's also b'shas kamar malacha. It's something that is towards the end of the processing of the item. But again, that's not really the main thing that the price is coming to teach you. And a worker, which that's really the ox, but as we said before, we compare the ox to the worker. He also has the halach of this pasuk to teach you that of course shekaduli karka. Also, anything that grows in the ground, like wheat, which is what threshing is done on, the owner, the worker could eat from it. You can't stop him from eating. Yotze, that excludes hachaylev. If the worker is doing milking of the cow, or he's doing some type of curdling of the milk, or magavin and making cheese, such a worker, no, shein geduli karka. These are not things that grow from the ground, which Taisa discusses on the top. Although we find elsewhere that an animal is called geduli karka, that's only because the animal gets sustained from the ground. He eats the grass or whatever. But here, we're comparing to dayish, and dayish means literally it's geduli karka, grows from the ground. That excludes these things, and therefore so therefore the worker is not going to eat from the cheese, from the milk, whatever it is that they're working, because it's not geduli karka. Says the Gemara, why do I need to compare it to dayish to teach me that is excluded from cheese and milk and those type of things? I already know this from the pasuk that says when you come into your friend's vineyard, a vineyard is something that grows from the ground. That teach me this halacha only applies to things that grow from the ground. Says Gemara, Itzrach no is necessary. So you would have thought to say kama. It says kama. Now we said that l'rabis kol bali kama, which is kaima, all things that have any height. L'rabis nami midi delav geduli karka. I would think also that includes even things that don't grow from the ground. Mashma, that's there to tell you, no, it has to be similar to dayish, which are things that grow from the ground. Those are the things that we allow him to eat from. Okay, that's one brayso. So that's one limitation that we said, that the halacha of dayish has to be geduli karka. Another brayso. Dayish, ma dayish miyuchad, just like threshing is distinct as davish b'shas kamar malacha. It's something that now is when you're working with the produce in the final stages, like harvesting. Rashi just says that our Mishnah was talking about after the Gemara Malacha. That's when we don't eat. For example, we're going to say on Daf Tzadi Gimel, Nesparsu Igulin, when you have these cake of dried figs and they get separated, and then you want to put it back together again. That's something that's already was Nigma Malachtai. That's something that is not going to have the halacha of allowing him to eat. But here we mean to say something in the final stages. Then the worker can eat from it. Okay, also anything that's at the final stages of the work, the worker could eat from. That excludes that if he's weeding out garlics and onions from the plantation, which the Gemara assumes that the reason why he's taking out these onions and garlics because they're not good ones. You're weeding it out. Since it's not the final stages of this plant, the worker could not eat from them. Says the Gemara, Lamali, why do I need to learn this out from comparing it to dayish? The Torah tells me that, as we said in the previous daf, that when you're eating, you shouldn't be putting into your bowls, which teaches it's at a time when you're putting it to the employer's bowls. That's when you eat. And the saying, but don't put into your own bowls, meaning, but then you could eat it, you just can't put it into your bowls because you're putting it into his bowls. But if it's not a time when you're putting it into the bowls of the Baal Bais, then you cannot eat. So I already know that the worker can only partake while he's harvesting for his employer, not while weeding, because it's not at the final stages, not when you're putting it into his bowls. So the Gemara, no, it's necessary. We're saying, avagav de komashlev ketini. Even though that what you're doing is you're removing the small edible bulbs that are certain from the onions that are like a eunuch type, meaning to say that it's like immature, it's never going to fully get large. So you pull them out mibein alimi from the big ones to expand the space that they could spread out, where actually you are putting it to the Caleb Shabbat Abayis. He's actually going to eat those small onions. So it's not excluded from El Kel Yechalei Sitain because they are edible. It's only excluded from Dayish because it's not Gemar Malach. It's not the time of Gemar Malacha because the primary worker is because of the remedy of the big ones, which they're still attached and they're still there. You're not finished the process, not towards the end of the stages. So therefore, it wouldn't be excluded from Bekel Chilisitin. Therefore, we have to learn that out from comparing it to Dayish. That's Brisa number 2. Brisa number 3. Tani Duchel, another Brisa. Again, another comparison to Dayish, to threshing. Ma Dayish miyuchad, just like threshing is distinct. That's a davar shalei nigmar malachta lamaiser. It's something that the product is not processed enough to be obligated in Meiser Achala. So that's when you say the halacha of Payil Oichabay, thank you, that the worker could eat from it. So to anything that it's meaning because Dayish, threshing, is not yet the halacha of B'Mechuyev Meiser is only when after you threshed and after you went and you gathered it and you put it into a pile, then it's Mechuyev Meiser. So threshing, when you're telling me that you have to let the ox and let the worker eat, is something that's not Nigmar Malach Meiser. That's when Payil Oichabay. Yotza, that excludes Haboidel B'Tamarim Ubegregris. If there's someone's working with dates and dried figs they're connected them. They used to make these cakes out of them, and he's separating them with like a shovel. They would have this tool to separate these tightly pressed cake of figs. This is something that is already mechuyev meiser, and now what you're doing is you're just separating the figs. They're in Payil Oichabay if the worker is working with this, even though it's something that's like we said, it's a davar shegeduli karka. Even though it has some of the other characteristics, and it's by the Gemar Malacha, but it's already nigmar malachta lamaiser. So then you're not going to have the heter of eating. Says the Gemara, really, that's true? But V'tanya learned the Brisa that actually says haboidel b'tmagam u'b'gregris. If someone's separating the dates or the dried figs, Payil Oichabay, a worker does eat from it. That seems to contradict what we just said. So Amar Papa says, no, Kitani, when we learn that Brisa is b'sechlone. It's talking about inferior dates that don't ripen on the tree, and they put it into a bowl made from palm fronds, which is called chesalis, this basket, and they get heated up and they get ripened. Now, before they're ripened is where we said that if someone is separating from those cakes, the worker could eat from it because those dates are not nigmalach lamaisi because they're not fully ripened yet. But in general, when you would have a cake of dried figs, they're already fully ripened and they've been already ready to have meiser separated from them. That's where we're saying that it wouldn't have the halacha of allowing him to eat because it's already nigmalach lamaisa in contrast to what dayish is. Tanya, they learned in a fourth brisa. Dayish, threshing, ma dayish miyuchid, just like threshing is distinct, davar shloi nigmalachta l'chala, it's something that's not ready for the chiv of challah, because challah only takes effect when you have the flour mixed with the water, and here you're threshing, you're just getting the kernels of wheat out of the stalks. Oh, and then the Payil Oichabay, then the worker eats from it. Okay, so to anything that is not, the process is not finished to be obligated challah, then Payil Oichabay. Yatsa, we're excluding halosh, if someone is kneading it, which is that when he puts the water into the flour and he mixes it, then it's chayav and challah, and you still have a few processes that you need to do of kneading and of pushing it down and v'hamakatev, or if someone is shaping the dough, or if he bakes it, if you're doing that job, if you're the guy who shapes he braids the challah in the bakery, so that's something that's already obligated. The process has already been finished to be chayav and challah from when they put in the water. They in Payil Oichabay, so such a worker has no rights to eat because it's not similar to dayish. So the Gemara wants to understand this last brisa. What do you mean? Why it should be sufficient because of the halacha of meiser, but and as Rashi explains, why you tell me that when it's nigmalach the lachala, oh, you lost your rights, it's already past what dayish is. What do you mean? You have the grinding, you have the sifting, which happened even before the kneading, and even from then you can't eat because the chiyuv of meiser was when you put into a pile. So what are you telling me with challah? Challah is even later, the obligation. It's earlier that you can't eat from it. Earlier because of the chiyuv of meiser. So the Gemara attempts to say, loikash is not difficult because we're talking about b'chutz la'aretz askina. The leka meiser, there's no meiser in chutz la'aretz. So it's over there where we're saying that when it's mechuyev and challah, that's when he can't eat anymore. So challah is the same thing. As Taisa says, it's only rabbinic also, like it's obviously Gemara B'chayra. So how is that different than the halacha of meiser? So the Gemara says, El olam ba'aretz. Okay, you're right. That's not a good answer to say chutz la'aretz. No, we're talking about where it's in Eretz Yisrael. Like Kash, it's not difficult. We're talking about b'shevesh kibshu b'shevesh achilku. We're talking about in the 14 years when they came into Eretz Yisrael, there were 7 years that they conquered it and 7 years that they divided it. So how does that help differentiate regarding the chiv of challah? Because the Amar, the master says, the Gemara in Ksubis and Gemara Nida, the 7 years that they conquered and the 7 years that they divided, for those 14 years, there was a chiv of challah, but there was no obligation of meiser, as the pasuk says, when you're going to come into the land. The pasuk differentiates this coming in from all the times that when it talks about them coming into Eretz Yisrael that I mentioned in the Torah, because it says by them kisavayu, and here it says b'vayachem, which means the moment they came into Eretz Yisrael they were chayav v'chala. But meiser they weren't obligated until after they inherited and they settled it, like it says asa to aser, and then it says after that b'makom asher yivchar, until Shiloi, which was where the Mishkan was chosen, they weren't chayav meiser, which is that's only after they conquered and divided, as it says in Sefer Yeshua. For all those years that they divided and conquered, then the El Moel was in Gilgal for those 14 years, like Gemara says in Zvachim Daf Kofit Chesed Beis. The halacha meiser didn't apply. Oh, gavaldik. So in those 14 years, if you were grinding or sifting, which there was no chiyuv of meiser yet, yeah, the worker was allowed to eat. There's only when you put the flour with the water, when you're kneading it, then there's a chiyuv of challah. Oh, then it's not like dayish. So it's for those 14 years that we have to say that the idea of challah. But the Gemara doesn't like this because midi meiser kugarim. You think it's the halacha of the chiyuv of meiser that causes to remove the workers from allowing them to eat? No, it's not the meiser shabai. Gemara malacha kugarim. It's the end of the process that causes, because and that's what you're learning from dayish, that it doesn't make a difference when it's a time of chiyuv meiser or when there's no chiyuv meiser, because it doesn't say anything about meiser by the eating of the worker. It says threshing. So we're qualifying that. We're saying, oh, threshing is not when you're done yet, because when you're done, oh, that's when meiser's chal. And if there's no chiyuv meiser, it doesn't make a difference. It's the gemara malacha. So how could you tell me that when you are grinding and then you would say that, oh, there's no chiyuv meiser, so then the worker will be allowed to eat? No, that is, you already had gemara malacha. It's not similar to dayish. So that's not a good answer. So Elam Ravina, rather Ravina says that actually these last two brises don't teach them individually to say, oh, the first one's teaching you that just like threshing dayish is distinct, that's not nigma mlacht l'meiser, because if you say that as a separate brisa, so then you obviously know if it's nigma l'meiser can't eat, the last brisa would be difficult, because what are you talking about challah? Challah is even a later stage. You already can't eat from an earlier stage. Rather, he says, no, kadach v'tani. Wrap it together and read it as one brisa. The last two brises are one brisa, as follows. Dayish, the pasuk says that you have to let the worker and the animal eat when he's threshing. Ma dayish miyuchad, just like threshing is this thing, it's something that's not yet finished the process, l'meiser u'l'chala, which are things that apply to wheat. Wheat has a chiyuv of, has meiser and has chala. Oh, if it didn't have, it's not finished the process for meiser chala, upay loichel, and the worker can eat from it. Av kol shaloi nigmalachte, so to anything that didn't have its process finished for whatever applies to it. If it's, let's say, only has meiser, then it's lameiser. Let's say dates, doesn't have flour, doesn't have challah, and ulachala. If it has application of challah, has for challah, then poil oichel bay, then the worker could eat from it. As Rashi explains, so that excludes, let's say, when you're separating the dates from the cake of figs, okay, there it's nigma lamaiser, and it doesn't have anything later than that because it doesn't have a chiv of challah. That's what one idea would be referred to. Now, then the question was, what would be the relevancy of talking about kneading, which is the chiv of challah, if it's already been separated, if it's already been off limits already from when you did the earlier stage of chiv meiser? No, it's the later one. The later obligation that applies, like let's say when you have some chiv of challah, actually, when you get to grinding and sifting, you actually could eat from it. It's the later one that applies to it, and therefore that's what we're saying. So it's both. It's chiv and meiser if it doesn't have challah, or it's going to be the chiv of challah if it's, let's say, something like wheat. Then we're saying it's not finished, it's not nigma malachta, because you still didn't get to a later stage of which is applying to this thing of challah. Now, Ibailu, the following question relating to these halachas of the worker eating what he's working with, what's the halacha? Is a worker allowed to go ahead and start roasting the food, toasting the food on the fire, and eat this, let's say, these kernels of wheat? He wants to make some granola out of it, because when you put it over the fire, it sweetens the taste. Or let's say grapes, also if you put it on the fire, and if you put it in the freezer, I guess people also do cold and hot. What's halacha? Could you put it over the fire and eat it? What's the question? So the Gemara says, "Mi have a kanov medavar achar." We already mentioned the previous daf that the Torah tells you. We darshan every word in the pasuk, and we said when it says that you're going to come to the vineyard of your friend and you're going to eat anovim kenavshecha, the grapes to your heart's desire. It's saying only the grapes. Can't be the grapes with something else, because eating it with something else, some relish, it makes an appetite. You can end up eating too much. Okay, it has to be only the item itself. The question is putting it into the oven, is singeing it also considered like adding something else, and therefore it'd be forbidden or not? So the Gemara says, Tashmat's being arrived from the following brisa. The brisa says, Rashai balabayis lahashkis poilim yain. The employer is allowed to give wine to the workers, so that they don't eat many grapes. It's not considered as an inappropriate practice. He's allowed to give them in the workers' room over there. He's putting out wine for them. The guys, they're not interested in eating anymore. They're already satisfied. Okay. Now the other halacha is the one we want to bring a raya from. The workers are allowed to dip their bread in brine. Why would they do that? It gives them an appetite. The exact opposite. I mean, each one is allowed to do, for their vested interest. So the workers could dip their bread in brine so that they should eat a lot. So you see, says the Gemara, that the worker is allowed to do something to increase the appetite, which is, just like we're trying to say, when you put it onto the fire, that's going to increase his appetite. You see, it's something that's permitted to be done. Which the Gemara in Amud Beis says, no, that's not a raya. Because lachshure gavra, for the person to prepare himself for a lot of eating, like before the Nathans, the guy has to do whatever it is to get all those franks and whatever. He's prepare himself. Look at me, on that we didn't have a question. The Torah never made it forbidden for him to make himself have an appetite, because that's not like a novim v'davar acher. By there, it's the grapes. That's kikimi boilon lachshuri peir. We want to know in the chefza, not in the gavra. Can you take the grape itself and make that more not his appetite, but make it, what would you say on the chefza, appetible for such a thing? I mean, how can you make this more appetizing? That was the word I was looking for. Exactly. So that's on the chefza, not you having an appetite. More appetizing. What's the halacha? So that, again, you can't prove it from the guy himself, because he can make himself have a bigger appetite, but to make the thing appetizing, that's our question. So the Gemara says Tashmat being arrived from a different brisa. The brisa says Poilin Eichlin Anovim. The workers could eat grapes, and but they could, whatever they're eating, they could delay until they get to Bereishi Omania Shalahem, to the ends of the rows of the vineyard, because the end of the rows are the best parts, because that's like an end unit where it's like it's open and the sun is hitting down on it because it's not covered by any of the other vines, and it sweetens it. Obviously, we want those sun that to get to the work its photosynthesis magic on those grapes. So you could wait when you're a worker. You could wait till you get like musical chairs till you get to the end over there and start eating the grapes over there. But actually have a bar. Okay, so you can get the sweetest ones that at the edge. But one thing you can't do, says the Bride, says you're not allowed to fire it up in the oven. You can't heat it up over a fire. So you see clearly the answer to our question. Which interesting, the Gemara says no, it's not a raya. Why not? Because hasam mishum bitl malacha. The reason why the Bryce is not letting you is not like you think because it's anavim b'davar acher. It's very simple. The guy's wasting time when he's making that little fire over there to take his grapes or to take his wheat kernels. That's why you're not allowed to do that, because you're not working, you're not on the job. Our question was, if the guy has, it's a whole family affair where he brings his wife and kids to the job and they're not employed, because sometimes you have the whole family working over there. No, they're not employed over there. So Tati's working over there, and Tati's allowed to take food. It's just Tati, you're not allowed to take anything home with you. So then the kid look over there with the wife. Are they allowed to go ahead and make a little fire over there for B'schus Rabbi Shimon? They make the bonfire. So are they allowed to put in also the grapes and sweeten up what's the halacha? That's our question regarding the halacha of anav medavar acher. So I'm going to say, okay, Tashmat's bring a raya from another brisa. The brisa says, lo yahava be'or b'yochel. You're not allowed to put into the fire and eat it. V'lo yichmor ba'adam b'yochel. Neither are you allowed to go ahead and heat it up by putting it into like this warm earth and eat it. V'lo yafrach hagabe asela b'yochel. You can't crack it on a rock and eat it, like the way people do it for apples. What you could do is you could go ahead and crack it with one hand to another hand and eat over there. So you see that no, you're not allowed to. The first thing the Brisa said was you're not allowed to go ahead and sweeten it by putting it over the fire. The Gemara says no, that's the same thing we just rejected before. That's simply because you're not doing your job. You're busy with all these other things. That's why it's forbidden. The Gemara says actually it's logical what we're saying. Because that's only because he's wasting time from his job. Because the Isa could do everything like you were trying to bring a raya mishumituki peida because it's sweetening the fruit, and that's the problem because now it's like anav medavar acher. But sella, when you're taking the apples and you're banging it on the rock, what type of sweetening the fruit is over there? The Gemara says no, it's not true. It's not a raya because it's possible. It's not possible. It's not going to sweeten a little bit. Anytime the juices get released, it's going to make it sweeter, and therefore when you bang it on the rock, it will make it sweeter, and therefore it could be. So it's not a raya either way, but it could be that it would be forbidden because of anav medavar acher. So we have not yet brought a raya. So the says, okay, Tashma, try to bring another raya from the following brisa. If you have workers that were harvesting, all these terminologies are terminologies of harvesting. It's just every type of species has a different word related to it. So workers that were harvesting by the figs, or tomorrow were harvesting the dates, or were harvesting the grapes, or were harvesting the olives. So the workers are allowed to eat because this is the classic halacha of the Gemara Malacha, which we learn of Kisabe B'Kerem Re'acha, and he's pater from Meiser. Meaning, what's the chiddush? We don't say that it's a mekach, which is because it's a transference over here with the employers giving it to the employee, some type of like a sale, which would then make it mechuyev meiser, as we said in the previous daf. No, because it's not a condition of their payment of like a part of the wages, like a transfer. Rather, it's because the Torah is giving him the rights to eat it, and therefore it's not going to be obligated meiser as a mekach. Okay, but continues the brisa, Pitam lo yoichlu. With their bread, they're not allowed to eat it. Now, it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about whether the worker may eat from the owner's produce, it involves two potential issues, and that's why we don't want to get confused. There's these two halachas. There's a mamana issue, a monetary issue, because he's taking something that belongs to another person, and that's what we're talking about. Is he allowed to eat the guy's stuff? Then there's a isura, a possible prohibition, because in certain situations it might be chayiv b'meiser, which is what we were just addressing a second ago, that we say that they're pater from meiser. But now the Bryce is telling us that they're not allowed to go ahead and eat it with their bread. So that is a monetary halacha. Because, why can't you eat it with bread? Because that's anavim v'davar acher. We said you can't eat the grapes, you can't eat whatever you're eating with something else, because that's going to cause you to eat a lot. So eating with your bread is going to give you a bigger appetite. So that you can't do, because that's stealing from him, because that's not the heter of dayish. Unless you get permission from the employer. Employer lets you, he lets you. That's his monetary, that's his money. That's going to be okay. Now, now you cannot dip the food that you're working with b'melech, with salt, v'yochel, and eat. Now Rashi explains, the Gemara is assuming that the reason why you can't dip it in salt and eat it is because of a violation of the same reason, of anav medavar acher, because it's going to give you an appetite, and you're adding something else to the grapes. Not because of meiser, not because that would have anything to do with the isura part. That's important to keep in mind, is dina and isura. And we might change one with the other, but the Gemara is assuming that you see, you say that when you're making the food item more appetizing, that it's going to be aser. So that answers our question with havava ba'ur about putting it over the fire. Says the Gemara, no. No, salt for sure is like putting a grape with something else. Because even though you're just scattering some salt on the grapes, and it's not something independent that you're eating with the grapes, like bread, but ultimately it's something else. But be mahaviv, which you're not adding anything, fire is not being added to it's just changing the chemical properties of the grape, maybe I would say that would be permitted, so that wouldn't be a raya for the halacha that we're asking about hava ba'ur. So the Gemara actually doesn't resolve the question, seemingly, and this is where the Gemara ends. Then the Gemara, however, once we mentioned this idea of this last words of the Brisa we tried to bring a raya from, the Gemara now takes that and shifts and asks on that halacha itself. He said in the Brisa that the worker is not allowed to take the grapes, whatever it is eating, and dip it into salt and eat it. Says the Gemara, but it seems to be contradicted from the following Brisa. Why? The Brisa says, if someone hires a worker la'adir to dig, or lekashkish, or to cover the uncovered roots, tachas hazeisim, that's beneath the olive tree. If a guy's doing such a job, he's not allowed to eat, let's say, from the olives in that tree, because it's not kamar malacha. That's not towards the end of the processing, like threshing. This is stam a guy's doing way early in the season. Now, Sachar Livtzer, if he hired him to harvest the grapes, or Schar Limsik, or he hired him to harvest the olives, or Schar Lalaket, or he hired him to harvest all the other types of fruits. So those that fall on the ground, he's allowed to eat it, because again, that's the timing when the pasuk says he's allowed to eat it. And he's pater from meiser, like we said, because it's not a mekach. Shatur zichslan, and this we said before, because the Torah is giving him the rights to eat it. Okay, continues the Brisa, katzatz. Let's say he stipulated with the employer on the condition that he could eat. Let's say when he hired him to do the hoeing, you told me then it's not gemar malacha. You told me he cannot eat. Okay, let's say he made up with him that he lets me eat. So that makes it similar to a mekach, to a purchase. It's not the Torah zichslan. It's the employer saying, okay, buddy, fine, I want you to work. I let you eat from the stuff that you're working with. Says the Brisa, okay, now there's a certain limitation over here for a different reason. Obviously, there's no mamaina, there's no dina halach here, and there's no isser, but there's no problem regarding the guy's money, because he lets you. But you have the other area of halacha of meiser that's going to be a problem. Achaz v'achaz yochel, says the Brisa, okay, one at a time, you're allowed to eat them. Why? Because when it's less than two, it doesn't have the prohibition of the name of a goyrin on it with something that's not nigma malachte. When it's finished is one thing. It's not even finished. But if it's one, that's not a problem. But shtaim l'yechel, two at a time, he's not allowed to eat. Why? Because two, once it gets to a significant state of when you make up with someone, or it's a mekach, then actually the name goyrin, which is when it's like smoothed out pile, actually takes effect in it, as the Gemara learns out from Asmachta, from a pasuk later on. Now, Rashi explains, he says, this kvias of ketzitza, which is when you make it up a price with someone or mekach, a purchase, is rabbinic, as the Gemara says. It said on Daf Peches Medalv, because if it's deraisa, then there wouldn't be any difference between 2 and 1. But is there a rabbinic halacha that when you're like making a transfer, you're taking a certain a stage over here, a status of like a ketzitza, then 2 would be like a kvias, so you wouldn't be able to eat because of the halacha of meiser. And then the brisa concludes and it says that b'seifis b'melach b'yoichel. He could dip it into salt and eat. Now the Gemara assumes at this point that this dipping into the salt has no relevancy regarding meiser. The reason why we're saying it is only simply that the balabayis, the employer, cannot stop him, even though it's going to give him a bigger appetite. He can't stop him from doing such a thing. That's what the Gemara is assuming again, that that's this idea of dipping into salt. Says the Gemara, okay, if that's the case, ahai. When you just told me that he could dip into salt and eat, which case in this brisa is it going on? Because there's a reisha and there's a seifa in the brisa. We spoke about the guy who's hoeing and doing all these types of work, which he's really not allowed to eat. You could give him permission, but he's not allowed to. And then there's when he was working on things like on the harvesting, which he is allowed to eat. Which halacha are you mentioning that when he's eating, he could dip into salt? Ilema seifa, if you think is going on the seifa, which was that we said that it's one of those activities he's not allowed to eat. But okay, if you guys made up, then he's obviously allowed to eat. So wait a second, it can't be on that case that you're letting him dip into salt and eat, because keeping the katzat, since you made up with him, then he could eat however he wants. No gzeirus akasim on that. It's not the biblical case. He said he could eat. So then why would I need to tell you could dip into salt? Obviously going on the case of the ratio, when you did not set up anything, it's just the biblical case of when the Torah lets you eat. Oh, and the Bryce is telling me that you're allowed to dip it into salt. If you recall, the Bryce we said just before that said in the biblical case, so if a contradiction in the Torah case, when you're allowed to eat by harvesting, are you allowed to dip it into salt or not? Some Bryce says loy kasha, it's not difficulty. Why not? Kan, the first Bryce that says it's aser is ba'aretz in Eretz Yisrael. Kan here, the second brisa is b'chutz la'aretz, out of Eretz Yisrael, because as Rashi explains, now the Gemara is shifting. This halacha of dipping into the salt is not because of the halacha of anav medavar acher. It's not regarding what Rashi calls dina, regarding monetary rights. Are you allowed to do this with that guy's item? It's because of the significance of the eating regarding the halacha of meiser, of that you can't eat because of beinodim lamakam, not because of beinodim lachaveroi. And it's going on the seifa, as Rashi explains, which the Gemara says, ba'aretz, in Eretz Yisrael, where the meiser is biblical. Oh, okay, so kavas afisa. Dipping into salt, which is a new idea we didn't think about up until now, is like a gemar malacha. Gemar malacha, dipping into salt? Yes, says Rashi, because you're revealing your intent that there's not going to be another garin with this thing. If you're dipping into salt, it means you're ready to eat it. Oh, so it's like a chalois gairin. It's taking effect. It's making it like you're done with this. You're finished the process. Okay? So now it's so where it's biblical, we're going to tell you can't eat dipping into salt because you have to take meiser. But b'chutz la'aretz, out of Israel, where there's no chiv of meiser in the Torah, like kavas svisa, dipping into salt did not make a kviz, did not make a permanence to have to say you can't eat from it now as a worker. However, Amar Rava doesn't like Abaya's answer. He says, Mika midi, is there such a thing? The ba'aretz in Eretz Yisrael, you tell me kavas svisa midiraisa, that biblically dipping into salt is going to make it obligated ma'aser, but chutz la'aretz like kavas svisa, that in chutz la'aretz, that dipping into salt is not going to make any kviz umuter likatchila, and you like initially go ahead and dip it into the salt and eat it. As Rashi explains, where the its ma'aser is rabbinic, so at least you should say that the dipping into salt should be rabbinically prohibited, because we know the Talmudic dictum, a kol de takun rabban came to Rashi, whatever the rabbis into, they did like on the biblical ideal. So at least rabbinically it should be prohibited. How can you tell me that yispas b'melach likatchila? So Elam Rava, rather Rava gives his own answer. He says no. Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, doesn't make a difference where you are. Eretz or chutz la'aretz. Chada, when you're taking one grape and you're dipping into salt, like kavas vista. Dipping into salt is not going to make it obligated meiser, and you're allowed to eat one at a time. Tarti, 2, kavas sofista. Then dipping into salt does make it kavua, as the Gemara is going to learn that later on, because less than 2 is not considered as a geirin. And then yes, you wouldn't be able to, because then you can be chayiv meiser. Katzatz, when you made up with the guy beforehand, let's say you were doing hoeing, you were doing some type of a work, which really should not allow you to go ahead and eat, but you said, the employer says, yeah, okay, I let you eat because I want that for our contract. Then bein safas or bein loy safas. Whether you dipped into the salt or you didn't dip into the salt, the actual katzitza, the making up of this contract, considers it a significance like a geirin when there are 2. So achas eichel, 1 at a time you're allowed to eat. But shtaim leichel, 2 at a time you cannot eat. Now, since the eating is through a katzitza, so that's we're saying that you're not allowed to do it 2 at a time, only 1 at a time. So there is where we say that dipping into salt is not going to be a kviyas, because it's only 1. And therefore we said, seif is b'melech va'eichel. That's the Bryce says you can dip into salt and eat it, because it's going on the seifa, which was the case of ketzitza, which ketzitza allows you to eat 1 at a time. That's how Rav is answering the question, that in such a case is where the first Bryce would allow you to dip into salt and eat. You're right, generally dipping into salt and eating it is going to be a problem in the biblical halacha. But in the case of ketzitza, is where that Bryce was saying that when you're eating the 1 at a time, you could dip it into salt and eat it. Now, what happens if loy katzat v'loy safas? What happens if you didn't go ahead and make it up beforehand? You're not someone that's not allowed to. You're the biblical worker. And v'loy safas, you didn't dip it into salt. Okay, then you can eat 2 at a time. You can do whatever you want. Safas, if you dip it into salt, you can only eat 1 at a time. 2 at a time you cannot eat. Because v'avagav the noplu rishus mebalabayis, even though you took permission from the whole no. In other words, it's not a problem. Let's say abanav medavar acher. There's no problem with that. But the problem is the itvelu lemeiser. But now it's considered tevel untithed for the halacha meiser because of kavas svista. Because the dipping in the salt makes a kviyas, and that's why in the first brayse it said v'lo yisbais that you're not allowed to dip it into salt. I mean, we just explained a moment ago when the brayse says you're allowed to dip it into salt was going on the case of ketzitza. When you're eating 1 at a time, then you're allowed to dip it into salt and eat it. The first price that said you're not allowed to dip it into salt was not when you're doing a ketzitza. And therefore you're eating 2 at a time. You're eating 2 at a time. No, then you can't. So basically it's the same idea. You're not allowed to do 2 at a time. It's just depending which case. When we're talking about ketzitza, then we're inherently saying 1 at a time. Because ketzitza cannot do 2 at a time. Because ketzitza itself would make it into geirin. So that's the Bryce that's talking about 1 at a time. 1 at a time, you're allowed to dip in the salt and eat it. But if you're on the biblical guy can eat 3 at a time, 4 at a time. On him is who we say you cannot dip it into salt and eat it because that's 2 at a time. Because basically that principle is dipping into salt will be kaveh with 2 and not with 1. It says the Gemara, v'tarti the kaveh svistam and all. And this idea that you're telling me, which is really the main principle, it's just that we're saying again different cases to just tell you which one's 1, which one's 2. This that dipping the salt is kaveya for the halachas of ma'aser. Where do you know? In other words, where do you know you need to have 2 and not less than that? Which traces on different masas, but Tarti just points out that the truth is mekach, a purchase, also needs 2, as we said before. It's just because we're talking about svista, so therefore we mentioned svista, but it's both the same idea. How do we know that 2 is going to be a kviyas, either for a purchase or dipping into salt? So that Amar Masna says because the Amakra, the pasuk says, which Tosa points out it's an asmachta, it's only an illusion, that's not what the pasuk's talking about. The pasuk in Micha says, Kikibtzam, when you gather them, the Umas Ha'olam, Ka'amr Garna, like sheaves by the granary, which is what that Hashem is preparing to destroy the enemy, which a geirin is not with gathering. And gathering, you can't gather less than 2. So from there you see that it's going to be with 2. We'll do just a little bit more to have the name of someone in the second. But we'll do it tomorrow again. Tanabon learn the Braisa regarding this idea of leisachsam. Paris hamanachsis betvua, v'hadoshes betruma ma'isa ina oivim mishum baltachsim. Abnei marasa ein maybe bull ma'isa min beternla betrakson shebevia. B'shimon ben Yochai oime maybe karshin nemetoyla shekashim yovas lamanakol. Schusher b'shimon kedayir b'shimon lismachala b'shas atchak shebezeicha. Gal ein abidna v'liz d'esecha. Thank you to anything for hosting us.